Welcome, dear viewers, to a tale that whispers across centuries, a story of love born from loss, hope rising from ashes, and a woman who dared to bloom where she was planted. In the antebellum South, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oaks like memories, we follow Charlotte Campbell as she transforms from fallen aristocrat to quiet revolutionary. This is her story of finding love in an arranged marriage and changing the world one gentle act at a time. Before we begin this journey together, tell me, where are you watching from today? I'd love to know which corner of the world joins us for this tale of the Charleston Rose. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe and leave a like. Your support helps these timeless stories reach souls who need them most. Charleston, South Carolina, autumn 1845. The Spanish moss swayed like tattered veils in the October wind, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour that would change everything forever. The morning mist clung to Magnolia Grove like a shroud, and Charlotte Sophia Campbell knew, with the intuition that comes to those who have learned to read sorrow in the silence between heartbeats, that this would be the last dawn she would ever witness from her childhood bedroom window. The great plantation house, with its weathered columns and wide verandas, stood sentinel over fields that had once flourished with cotton white as hope itself. Now they lay fallow, surrendered to creditors whose patience had worn thin as autumn air. The magnolia trees her grandmother had planted 50 years prior still bloomed, their creamy petals falling like tears onto the red earth that no longer belonged to the Campbell family. Charlotte pressed her palm against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched the last of the morning glories close their purple faces to the coming day. At 18, she possessed the quiet grace of old Carolina families, dark hair that caught light like polished mahogany, eyes the color of Charleston Harbor at twilight, and a dignity that poverty could not touch. Her morning dress, black silk that had once been her mother's finest, whispered against her skin as she moved through rooms that echoed with emptiness. The auction notice still lay on her father's desk, the ink stark against parchment that trembled when the wind found its way through the house. Colonel Edward Campbell had mortgaged everything after the Panic of 1837, gambling on cotton futures that crumbled like sand through desperate fingers. When the heart attack claimed him 3 months ago, it was almost a mercy. He had died before witnessing the final dissolution of everything 5 generations had built. Her mother, Catherine Whitmore Campbell, had followed him into death's embrace just 6 weeks later, consumption taking what heartbreak had begun. The Whitmore tobacco fortune had long since vanished, leaving Charlotte with nothing but bloodlines that could not pay debts and memories that could not fill empty coffers. The sound of wheels on the Oyster Shell Drive announced the arrival of Judge Roderick Ashford's carriage. Charlotte's uncle had come to collect what remained of his sister's daughter, a young woman educated in French and music, trained in the graces of a world that was disappearing like morning mist, but possessing no practical skills for survival in reduced circumstances. She gathered her few remaining possessions, her mother's pearl necklace, a leather-bound volume of poetry, the miniature of her grandmother painted in happier times, and a pressed magnolia blossom from the tree outside her nursery window. Everything else, the ancestral portraits, the imported furniture, the silver service that had graced tables where Washington once dined, all would be sold to satisfy the relentless hunger of debt. As Charlotte descended the curved staircase for the final time, her fingers trailing along the mahogany banister, worn smooth by countless hands of her lineage, she felt something shift within her soul, not breaking, but transforming, like coal pressed into diamond by immense weight and time. Judge Ashford waited in the foyer, his stern features softened momentarily by genuine sorrow. He had built his own fortune through law and rice plantations, understanding that in the New South, adaptation meant survival. "Charlotte, child," he said, his voice carrying the authority of Charleston courtrooms. "Your Aunt Margaret is eager to welcome you to Ashford Hall. You'll want for nothing there." But Charlotte understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would want for everything that truly mattered: independence, purpose, a place that was hers by right rather than charity. She nodded with the composure that was her birthright, speaking the proper words of gratitude, while her heart memorized every shadow and beam of light in the house where her childhood dreams lay buried. The carriage pulled away as the sun climbed higher, and Charlotte did not look back. But in her heart she carried the scent of magnolia blossoms, the whisper of Spanish moss in the wind, and a determination as deep and quiet as the roots of the ancient oaks that would outlive them all. What Charlotte could not know as the wheels carried her toward an uncertain future was that loss would become the very soil from which her greatest love would grow. Ashford Hall rose from the low-country landscape like a monument to rice and law, its Greek revival columns gleaming white against the backdrop of moss-draped oaks that had witnessed 2 centuries of Carolina history. The plantation stretched across thousands of acres, where endless rice fields reflected the sky like broken mirrors, and 400 enslaved souls labored to maintain the wealth that kept Judge Roderick Ashford among Charleston's most powerful men. Charlotte's aunt, Margaret Whitmore Ashford, received her with the cool courtesy reserved for impoverished relations, a kiss to each cheek that barely disturbed the powder on her face, a measuring glance that catalogued the quality of Charlotte's remaining wardrobe, and words of welcome that felt as carefully arranged as the formal gardens surrounding the great house. "You'll find your circumstances quite comfortable here," Aunt Margaret announced, leading Charlotte through rooms adorned with crystal chandeliers from Venice and furniture crafted by master artisans in Charleston's finest workshops. Though naturally certain economies must be observed. Your dear mother was always given to extravagances that prudence would have questioned. The bedroom assigned to Charlotte occupied the eastern wing, lovely but unmistakably positioned to remind her of her status as dependent. Morning light filtered through lace curtains that had seen better decades, and the Persian carpet bore the faded patterns of reduced expectations. A small writing desk by the window offered a view of the kitchen gardens, where house servants moved with the practiced efficiency of those who understood their place in the intricate hierarchy of plantation life. In the months that followed, Charlotte learned to navigate the subtle currents of charity that kept her fed, clothed, and carefully excluded from decisions about her own future. She attended family prayers in the mansion's chapel, where Judge Ashford read from Scripture about contentment in humble circumstances, while his own circumstances grew more lavish each season. She walked the formal gardens with Aunt Margaret, listening to lectures about the proper deportment of impoverished gentlewomen and the virtue of grateful silence. During Charleston's social season, Charlotte accompanied the family to St. Philip's Church, where she occupied a position calculated to demonstrate the Ashford family's Christian charity while ensuring that her reduced circumstances remained visible to all who mattered in low-country society. The whispered conversations that followed in her wake spoke of "poor dear Charlotte" and "such a tragedy," and "fortunate to have such generous relatives." Yet Charlotte found unexpected solace in the plantation's vast library, where Judge Ashford's collection included volumes on law, history, and natural philosophy that had gathered dust for years. In the quiet hours between dawn and breakfast, while the household still slept, she read voraciously, absorbing knowledge that would have been considered unnecessary for a woman of her station, but which fed a hunger in her spirit that charity dinners could not satisfy. The enslaved woman who tended her room, an elderly house servant named Patience, whose dignity had been tempered but never broken by decades of bondage, became Charlotte's unexpected teacher in the realities of plantation life. Through careful conversations conducted in whispers and meaningful glances, Charlotte began to understand the vast, complex world that existed beneath the surface of Southern gentility, a world of human hearts that beat with the same hopes and fears as her own, but within the brutal constraints of legal ownership. "Miss Charlotte," Patience said one morning while mending a tear in Charlotte's black silk morning dress, "sometimes the Lord puts us where we need to be, even when we can't see the purpose. Your mama, God rest her soul, she had a gentle heart. Maybe that gentle heart got passed down to where it's needed most. Winter melted into spring, spring bloomed into summer, and Charlotte grew into an understanding of her position that was both clearer and more complex than anything she had imagined. She was a lady without property, educated but not employable, refined but not financially valuable, except perhaps as a solution to someone else's problems. The realization came not as a shock, but as a slow dawning, like sunrise over the rice fields. Judge Ashford's conversations with his wife had grown more pointed, their glances in her direction more calculating. The economics of her situation were becoming clearer to them, and Charlotte understood that her period of grace was drawing to a close. On an April evening when jasmine perfumed the air and fireflies began their ancient dance in the gardens, Judge Ashford requested her presence in his study. The room smelled of tobacco and leather, filled with law books and the accumulated weight of important decisions. Charlotte entered with the composure she had learned to wear like armor, prepared for the conversation that would determine the next chapter of her carefully circumscribed life. But nothing could have prepared her for the name that would change everything: Alexander Pemberton. a man she had never met, who would become the cornerstone of her future. The late April rain drummed against the windows of Judge Ashford's study like an impatient visitor, and Charlotte sat with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for her uncle to speak words that would reshape her destiny. The fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the volumes of law books that had built the Ashford fortune, while outside, the low-country spring revealed itself in bursts of azalea and dogwood. "Charlotte," Judge Ashford began, settling his considerable frame behind the mahogany desk that had witnessed countless decisions affecting the lives of others, "your situation requires resolution. You are 20 years old, possessed of breeding and education, but without prospects that befit your station. Your aunt and I have given this matter considerable thought." He paused, studying papers that lay before him, with the same attention he might give to an important legal brief. Charlotte felt her heart steady itself, recognizing the moment she had sensed approaching like distant thunder. She had learned in these months of dependence to read the subtle signs that preceded life-altering announcements. "Alexander Pemberton has made an offer," Judge Ashford continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a problem neatly solved. "You may not be familiar with the name, but Pemberton is among the most successful planters in the state. His family came from Virginia in the 1780s, excellent bloodlines, impeccable reputation. His plantation, Riverside, encompasses 10,000 acres along the Ashley River, with holdings that make him one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina." Charlotte's fingers found the smooth pearls at her throat, her mother's necklace, one of the few treasures that had survived the dissolution of Magnolia Grove. The pearls felt cool and substantial, anchoring her to something real while her uncle's words painted a future she had not imagined. "Mr. Pemberton is 35, a widower of 2 years. His first wife died in childbirth along with the infant. He seeks a wife of good family who can serve as mistress of his plantation and in time provide heirs to continue the Pemberton legacy. Your bloodlines, your education, your circumstances make you an ideal candidate for such a position." The rain intensified, and Charlotte found herself thinking of the enslaved workers who would be laboring even in this weather, tending to the rice fields that sustained the Ashford fortune. Patience's words echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the Lord puts us where we need to be, even when we can't see the purpose." "What do you know of his character?" Charlotte asked, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what was being proposed. She had learned through observation and instinct that character mattered more than wealth in determining the quality of a life. Judge Ashford's expression grew more animated, as if he had been waiting for this question. "Alexander Pemberton is considered quite progressive in his methods. He has introduced modern agricultural techniques, provides better housing and medical care for his workers than most planters consider necessary. He was educated at the College of William and Mary, has traveled extensively, maintains business interests beyond cotton production. Most importantly for your situation, he specifically requested a wife of refinement and intelligence, rather than merely beauty or connections." Charlotte rose and moved to the window, watching the rain transform the gardens into impressionist paintings of color and light. Her marriage of convenience, carefully calculated to benefit all parties except perhaps the bride, whose heart was not consulted in these arrangements. Yet what were the alternatives? A lifetime of dependence, growing older in the shadow of charity, becoming the spinster relation whose presence reminded the family of their Christian duty. "When would this arrangement be concluded?" she asked, still facing the window. "Mr. Pemberton wishes to meet you next week, when he comes to Charleston on business. If the meeting proves satisfactory to both parties, we would announce the engagement immediately, with the wedding to follow in the autumn. September, perhaps, when the heat breaks and society returns to the city." Charlotte turned back to her uncle, studying his face for any sign that this decision might be negotiated or delayed. But Judge Ashford's expression held the finality of a legal judgment, and she understood that her choices were acceptance or a future that offered no security and little dignity. "I would like to know more about Mr. Pemberton before agreeing to meet him," she said finally. "His interests, his character, his expectations of marriage. If I am to be mistress of his plantation, I should understand what such a position would require." Judge Ashford's approval was evident in his relaxed posture. "Sensible girl. I have correspondence from his attorney and friends in Charleston society who can speak to his reputation. You will find him honorable, Charlotte. This marriage offers you everything your birth entitled you to expect, despite the unfortunate circumstances that have brought you to this point." That evening, Charlotte sat in her modest bedroom, reading the letter that Alexander Pemberton had written to Judge Ashford, outlining his expectations for a wife. His handwriting was strong and clear, his language direct but not ungenteel. He sought a woman who could manage a large household, represent his family in Charleston society, and bring intelligence and grace to his table. He offered financial security, social position, and respectful treatment of her person and opinions. What he did not offer was love, and what she could not offer was a heart untouched by loss and hope deferred. Perhaps, she thought as rain continued to whisper against her window, this arrangement might become something more than either of them dared to expect. The Mills House Hotel buzzed with the restrained excitement that attended Charleston's most important social negotiations, and Charlotte found herself grateful for the black silk dress that had been her mother's finest. It provided dignity that her circumstances might otherwise have lacked, and its severe elegance suggested seriousness of purpose rather than desperate need. Yet as Charlotte folded the letter and placed it in her writing desk, she felt a curious sense of possibility stirring within her carefully guarded heart. Alexander Pemberton rose as she entered the hotel's elegant parlor, and Charlotte's first impression registered surprise at his height and the gentle intelligence that illuminated features marked more by character than conventional handsomeness. His dark hair showed the first threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes, a warm brown that reminded her of rich Charleston coffee, regarded her with respectful attention rather than the calculating assessment she had expected. "Miss Campbell," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Virginia education tempered by years in the Low Country, "I am honored by your willingness to consider my proposal. Please, be seated. I have taken the liberty of ordering tea." The conversation that followed revealed layers beneath the formal arrangement that had brought them together. Alexander spoke knowledgeably of literature, having read widely during his university years and in the quiet evenings of widowerhood. He discussed his plantation not merely as a business enterprise, but as a complex community requiring careful stewardship, and his words revealed both the pride of ownership and the weight of responsibility. "Riverside has been in my family for 3 generations," he explained, stirring cream into his tea with movements that spoke of practiced elegance. "It is my hope that my wife would take interest in the household management and perhaps the broader welfare of all who live and work there." Charlotte found herself drawn into discussing topics that had occupied her thoughts during the months at Ashford Hall: the complexities of managing large households, the challenges of balancing traditional expectations with changing times, the delicate negotiations required to maintain order and purpose in communities where power was unevenly distributed. "My grandfather established the original plantation, my father expanded it, and I have tried to modernize operations while maintaining the traditions that have proven successful. I have observed," she said carefully, "that successful plantation management requires attention to details that extend far beyond the master's house. The health and contentment of all residents affect the prosperity of the whole." Alexander's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine interest. "You speak from observation rather than theory. That is refreshing. Too many of my peers delegate such concerns entirely to overseers, but I have found that personal attention to these matters produces better results for everyone involved." As the afternoon progressed, Charlotte discovered that the man who had seemed like a convenient solution to her uncle's problem possessed depths that challenged her assumptions about arranged marriages. He spoke passionately about agricultural innovations he had implemented, his investments in railroad development, and his careful studies of economic trends that might affect South Carolina's future. Most surprisingly, he asked her opinion on matters typically reserved for masculine consideration. When she mentioned her reading in his legal papers about tariff policies affecting rice exports, he engaged her in serious discussion about the economic pressures facing plantation agriculture and the need for diversification in uncertain times. "You have given these matters considerable thought," he observed, his tone carrying approval rather than surprise. "I confess, Miss Campbell, that I had hoped for intelligence in a wife, but I had not expected to find such well-informed opinions. Your uncle's description of your education appears to have been, if anything, understated." Charlotte felt color rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the unfamiliar pleasure of having her thoughts taken seriously. "My circumstances have afforded me time for reading and reflection. I have found that understanding the larger forces that shape our lives helps one navigate them more successfully. When Alexander requested permission to show her his townhouse on East Bay Street, properly chaperoned, of course, Charlotte agreed with curiosity about the man whose life she was considering joining. The Georgian brick mansion, with its elegant proportions and views of Charleston Harbor, revealed taste that favored comfort over ostentation, books over mere decoration, and quality that would endure over fashionable excess. "If you were to accept my proposal," he said as they stood in the library overlooking the harbor, "this would be your Charleston residence during the social season. I would hope you might feel comfortable making changes to suit your preferences. A house should reflect its mistress as much as its master." Charlotte moved to the window, watching ships navigate the channel that connected Charleston to the wider world. The offer represented more than marriage. It promised a return to the social position she had lost, financial security that would last beyond her lifetime, and perhaps most importantly, a sphere of influence where her thoughts and opinions might matter. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, turning to face him directly, "I must be honest about my circumstances. I bring nothing to this marriage except my education and my heritage. No dowry, no family connections that could advance your interests, no practical skills beyond those considered appropriate for a gentleman's daughter. Are you certain this arrangement serves your needs as well as mine?" Alexander smiled, and Charlotte saw warmth that transformed his serious features into something approaching handsomeness. "Miss Campbell, I have wealth enough for both of us, and connections sufficient for my purposes. What I seek is a partner who can think as well as ornament, who can manage complexity rather than merely direct servants, who can represent our family with dignity in society and wisdom in private counsel. Your circumstances demonstrate courage under adversity, a quality more valuable than inherited wealth." As the April sun set over Charleston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Charlotte felt the first stirrings of something that might, in time, grow into the love that neither of them dared to expect from this careful arrangement. Mom Saint. Philip's church stood like a white sentinel against the September sky, its steeple piercing the blue infinity that stretched over Charleston Harbor, and Charlotte Campbell's heart beat with the measured rhythm of inevitability as her wedding morning dawned bright and clear. The ancient bell tower, which had witnessed the marriages of 5 generations of Charleston aristocracy, would today ring for a union born of necessity, but blessed, perhaps, with possibilities neither bride nor groom had dared to articulate. In the bridal chambers at the Mills House, Charlotte sat before a mirror that reflected a woman transformed. The wedding dress, crafted by Charleston's finest seamstress from silk that had journeyed from France, fell in ivory perfection around her slender form. Chantilly lace, delicate as frost on winter windows, crowned her dark hair, while her mother's pearls encircled her throat like a blessing from generations past. Her hands, steady despite the magnitude of the moment, smoothed the silk that whispered promises against her skin. Aunt Margaret fussed with the arrangement of the train, her satisfaction evident in the way the morning light caught the expensive fabrics that proclaimed the Ashford family's generosity and good taste. "You look every inch the plantation mistress," she pronounced, adjusting the pearl earrings that had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother. "Alexander Pemberton is fortunate indeed to claim such a bride." Through the hotel windows, Charlotte could see the carriages of Charleston's most prominent families arriving at the church. Rice and cotton planters, merchants whose fortunes connected South Carolina to European markets, even visiting nobility from England, whose presence would lend international significance to the ceremony, all gathering to witness the union that would make her mistress of one of the state's largest plantations. The ride to St. Philip's passed in a blur of autumn light, filtering through moss-draped oaks, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, worn smooth by decades of carriages carrying brides to their destinies. Judge Ashford, resplendent in his finest black wool and proudly conscious of the advantageous match he had negotiated, offered his arm with the satisfaction of duty well discharged. "Your father would have been proud, Charlotte," he said as they paused at the church entrance, where ushers waited to escort her down the aisle that would separate her old life from her new. "This marriage restores you to your proper station and secures your future beyond any uncertainty." Inside the church, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the assembled congregation. The ancient sanctuary, where colonial governors and revolutionary heroes had worshipped, seemed to hold its breath as Charlotte appeared in the doorway. 200 guests rose as one, their faces reflecting approval, curiosity, and the subtle satisfaction that attended Charleston society, when proper arrangements were properly concluded. Alexander waited at the altar, his presence commanding even in the sacred space that had witnessed countless momentous occasions. His black mourning coat emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, while his expression combined solemnity with something that might have been anticipation. When their eyes met across the length of the church, Charlotte felt something shift within her carefully composed heart. Not love, perhaps, but recognition of a future that might hold possibilities she had not dared to imagine. The ceremony proceeded with the ancient dignity of episcopal tradition. The rector's voice, trained by decades of important occasions, carried across the sanctuary as he spoke of the holy bonds of matrimony, the mutual obligations of husband and wife, and the sacred nature of the commitment being undertaken. Charlotte heard herself speak the words that would bind her to a man she had known for mere months, yet her voice carried steady conviction rather than doubt. I, Charlotte Sophia, take thee, Alexander, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish and obey, till death us do part. Alexander's voice, when he spoke the corresponding vows, held warmth that transformed legal arrangement into something approaching sacred covenant. I, Alexander James, take thee, Charlotte Sophia, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. The ring that Alexander placed upon her finger bore the Pemberton family crest, a live oak intertwined with cotton blossoms, symbolizing strength rooted in southern soil. The gold felt warm against her skin, substantial with the weight of history and expectation, yet somehow lighter than the burden of uncertainty she had carried since losing Magnolia Grove. The wedding breakfast at the Mills house exceeded even Charleston's expectations for elegant entertainment. Tables groaned beneath displays of low-country delicacies, she-crab soup, oyster stuffing, hoppin' john, and syllabub that melted like sweetened clouds upon the tongue. European wines flowed like celebration itself, while the conversation sparkled with the wit and refinement that made Charleston society famous throughout the world. Charlotte moved through the reception like a woman born to such occasions, accepting congratulations with gracious composure, dancing the first waltz with her new husband while 200 guests watched approvingly. Yet beneath the performance of social perfection, she felt the peculiar sensation of watching herself from a distance, as if the real Charlotte Campbell remained somewhere else, observing this elegant stranger who had taken her place. As the afternoon dissolved into evening and the last of the guests departed with promises to call at Riverside during the winter season, Charlotte found herself alone with Alexander in the carriage that would carry them to their new life together. "Pemberton," Alexander said quietly, his voice holding wonder at the name that would now define her existence, and Charlotte realized that perhaps, in time, she might learn to inhabit that identity with the same grace she had brought to every other transformation her life had required. The carriage wheels hummed against the oyster shell drive as Riverside Plantation revealed itself through curtains of Spanish moss and twilight, and Charlotte felt her breath catch at the sight of the mansion that would now be her domain. The Spanish moss seemed to part like curtains as they traveled toward the Ashley River, and the setting sun painted the low-country landscape in shades of gold and amber that spoke of endings transformed into beginnings. The Greek Revival columns rose like sentinels against the darkening sky, their white stone glowing with the last light of her wedding day, while the Ashley River curved behind the house like a silver ribbon holding secrets of tide and time. Alexander's hand found hers as the carriage slowed, his touch gentle but purposeful. "Welcome home, Charlotte," he said, and something in his voice, warmth that went beyond courtesy, anticipation that transcended mere arrangement, made her heart stutter with unexpected possibility. The mansion that emerged from the live oak shadows surpassed even the grandest descriptions Charlotte had heard whispered in Charleston drawing rooms. 24 rooms spread across 3 stories, each window glowing with candlelight, as house servants prepared for the arrival of their new mistress. The curved double staircase that swept up to the main entrance seemed designed for a woman in silk and pearls, while the massive oak door bore brass fittings that gleamed like gold against the dark wood. Patience, the elderly house servant whom Alexander had brought from his previous residence to serve as Charlotte's personal maid, waited in the main hall with the dignity that distinguished the best of low-country domestic staff. Her weathered hands held steady as she accepted Charlotte's traveling cloak, and her eyes held approval as she studied the woman who would now oversee the complex world of plantation household management. "Welcome to Riverside, Mrs. Pemberton," she said, her voice carrying respect earned through decades of faithful service. "Everything has been prepared according to Mr. Alexander's instructions. Your chambers await your approval." The interior of the mansion spoke of wealth accumulated through 3 generations of successful cotton cultivation. Mahogany furniture crafted by Charleston's master artisans gleamed under crystal chandeliers imported from Venice, while Persian carpets in jewel tones covered floors of heart pine, polished to mirror perfection. French silk adorned the windows, and oil paintings of previous Pemberton generations gazed down from walls paneled in rich walnut. Charlotte's private chambers occupied the entire eastern wing of the 2nd floor, connected to Alexander's rooms by a sitting area that could serve as neutral territory for the delicate negotiations of married life. Her bedroom, decorated in shades of cream and gold that complemented her dark beauty, featured windows that offered views of formal gardens and the river beyond. A writing desk positioned to catch the morning light promised hours of correspondence with Charleston society, while a comfortable reading chair beside the fireplace suggested quiet evenings with the books that had always been her truest companions. "I hope you find these arrangements suitable," Alexander said, his manner suggesting genuine concern for her comfort rather than mere politeness. "If anything does not meet your preferences, you need only speak to Patience or to me directly. This is your home now, Charlotte, and it should reflect your taste as much as mine." As autumn settled over the Low Country, and Charlotte began to understand the rhythms of plantation life, she discovered that Alexander had not exaggerated his progressive approaches to estate management. The quarters that housed the enslaved workforce, while still bearing the fundamental injustices of the system, provided better housing and medical care than most plantations considered necessary. The cotton gin house operated with machinery that reflected the latest innovations, while the rice mill demonstrated Alexander's commitment to diversifying crops in uncertain economic times. Most surprisingly, Alexander included Charlotte in discussions that would traditionally have been reserved for masculine consideration. He showed her the plantation's account books, explaining the complex calculations required to balance cotton production with rice cultivation, the investments in railroad stock that provided income beyond agricultural profits, and the careful negotiations with Charleston factors who connected Riverside's crops to international markets. A plantation of this size requires management that goes far beyond traditional household duties, he explained one October morning as they reviewed the quarterly accounts in his study. "I hope you will take interest in these broader concerns. 2 minds often solve problems that confound one, regardless of the gender of those minds." Charlotte found herself drawn into the intricate world of plantation economics with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. Her quick mind grasped the relationships between weather, market prices, and profit margins, while her careful observations of household management revealed inefficiencies that had escaped previous attention. Within weeks, she was suggesting modifications to supply purchasing that would reduce costs without compromising quality, and her insights into seasonal planning helped optimize the coordination between fieldwork and household needs. The social obligations of plantation mistress proved equally engaging. Charlotte received visits from the wives of neighboring planters, learning the subtle hierarchies that governed low-country society and the careful balance required to maintain friendships that often concealed intense competition. She planned dinner parties that showcased Riverside's prosperity while demonstrating her own qualifications for inclusion among the plantation aristocracy, and her gracious hospitality quickly earned approval from the most demanding critics of Charleston society. Yet it was in the quiet evening hours, when the day's obligations had been discharged, and she and Alexander sat in the library sharing books and conversation, that Charlotte began to sense the possibility of something deeper than respectful partnership. Alexander's mind challenged her own. His observations revealed depths of character that impressed her judgment, and his treatment of her person combined courtesy with a warmth that suggested affection might grow from their careful arrangement. One evening in late November, as winter's first chill sent them closer to the library fire, Alexander looked up from the agricultural journal he had been reading and found Charlotte watching him with an expression that held curiosity rather than mere politeness. "You seem surprised by something," he said, closing the journal and giving her his full attention. "I am surprised by how much I have come to enjoy our conversations," Charlotte replied honestly. I expected marriage to be a series of parallel obligations rather than this. Alexander smiled, and Charlotte noticed how the expression transformed his serious features into something approaching handsomeness. And what would you call this, Mrs. Pemberton? Charlotte felt color rise in her cheeks as she realized that what she wanted to call it was the beginning of something that might, with patience and courage, become the love that neither of them had dared to expect from their carefully negotiated arrangement. January snow fell like grace over the Low Country, a rare benediction that transformed Riverside Plantation into a crystalline wonderland where Spanish moss wore crowns of white and the Ashley River reflected a sky the color of pearls. Charlotte stood at the library windows, watching the unusual weather blanket the cotton fields in pristine silence, and marveled at how winter had become a season of unexpected intimacy rather than mere endurance. The cold weather had drawn her and Alexander into the mansion's most comfortable rooms, where fires burned constantly and conversations deepened with the leisure that winter imposed upon plantation schedules. The cotton had been ginned and baled, shipped to Charleston factors for sale to European mills, and the rice fields lay dormant beneath the unusual snow. For the first time since their marriage, they had hours uninterrupted by the demands of agricultural supervision, social obligations, or the complex choreography of managing a household that served as community for hundreds of people. Alexander looked up from the letter he had been writing to his factor in Charleston, his expression holding the warmth that Charlotte had learned to recognize as genuine affection rather than mere courtesy. "The roads will be impassable for days," he said, setting aside his correspondence to join her at the window. "We are effectively prisoners of the weather, Mrs. Pemberton. However shall we occupy ourselves?" Charlotte felt her heart accelerate at his playful tone and realized that somewhere during these months of careful partnership, the formal arrangements of their marriage had begun to yield to something more precious and infinitely more fragile. "I suppose," she replied, matching his lightness while feeling the weight of deeper possibilities, "we shall have to make the best of our imprisonment." The days that followed passed in a haze of shared reading, long conversations that ranged from agricultural philosophy to European literature, and the gradual erosion of the polite distance that had characterized their early interactions. Alexander revealed himself to be widely read, possessed of opinions that challenged conventional wisdom, and surprisingly willing to discuss topics that most men considered inappropriate for feminine consideration. "I have been thinking," he said one evening as they sat before the library fire, "about your observations regarding the quarters. Your suggestions for improving the medical care available to the workers merit serious consideration." Charlotte looked up from the embroidery that occupied her hands while her mind wrestled with the contradictions of their situation, the fundamental injustice of slavery existing alongside the possibility of alleviating some small portion of suffering within that unjust system. "I can claim no expertise in such matters," she replied carefully, "but I have observed that healthier workers are more productive workers, and that small improvements in living conditions require relatively modest investments." "Precisely. And I believe your feminine sensibilities might identify needs that escape masculine attention. Would you be willing to tour the quarters with me when the weather improves? I value your judgment on matters that affect the welfare of everyone at Riverside." The conversation that followed revealed layers of complexity that Charlotte had not expected from her husband. Alexander spoke thoughtfully about the moral contradictions of owning human beings while striving to treat them humanely, his struggles to balance economic necessity with Christian conscience, and his hope that gradual reforms might eventually lead to more fundamental changes in Southern society. "I do not claim to have answers to questions that confound better minds than mine," he said, staring into the fire as if it might reveal solutions to problems that had divided the nation. "But I believe that how we treat those in our power reflects the content of our souls, regardless of the legal structures that govern our society." Charlotte found herself drawn into discussions that would have scandalized the ladies of Charleston society, yet which felt more honest than any conversations she had ever shared with another human being. She spoke of her observations at Ashford Hall, the dignity she had witnessed among enslaved people despite their circumstances, and her growing conviction that intelligence and humanity transcended the artificial boundaries that law and custom imposed. One snowy evening in February, as they sat reading in comfortable silence, Alexander set aside his book and studied Charlotte with an expression that made her heart flutter with anticipation of words she could not predict but somehow needed to hear. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that transformed her name into something precious. "I must confess that this marriage has exceeded my most optimistic expectations. I sought a competent manager for my household and a gracious hostess for Charleston society. I did not dare to hope for this." Charlotte set down her own book, meeting his gaze with courage that surprised her. "And what would you call this, Alexander?" He rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the snow continued to fall like a blessing upon the quiet world beyond. "I would call it the beginning of something I had not believed possible at my age, the growth of genuine affection, perhaps even love, between two people who entered marriage as strangers, but who might, with patience and honesty, become something more than partners in a convenient arrangement." Charlotte felt tears threaten as she absorbed words that she had wanted to hear, but had not dared to expect. "I had given up hope," she said quietly, "of finding love in this marriage. I thought myself fortunate to secure respect and kindness, but you are right. This has become something more, something that frightens me with its possibilities." Alexander returned to her side, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Why should possibilities frighten you, my dear Charlotte?" "Because," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of snow against the windows, "I have lost everything I ever loved before. I'm afraid to love again, afraid to hope for something that might be taken away." Alexander lifted her chin with gentle fingers, his eyes holding understanding that came from his own experiences of loss. "Love always carries the risk of grief, Charlotte, but the alternative, a life without love, carries the certainty of emptiness. I would rather risk heartbreak than guarantee loneliness." As the fire settled into glowing embers and snow continued to fall like promises outside their windows, Charlotte felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more precious, the hope that this marriage of convenience might become a love story worthy of the name. March brought unseasonable warmth to the Low Country, and Alexander surprised Charlotte with a proposal that sent her heart racing with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. "I think," he said over breakfast on a morning when jasmine perfumed the air and mockingbirds sang elaborate courtship songs in the live oaks, "it is time we had a proper honeymoon, Mrs. Pemberton. Savannah beckons, and I have business there that could easily accommodate pleasure." The Georgian townhouse on Bull Street that Alexander maintained for business purposes revealed itself to be an elegant refuge from the public nature of plantation life. 3 stories of weathered brick and graceful ironwork overlooked Forsyth Park, where ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss created cathedral spaces perfect for intimate conversations and private walks. The interior, furnished with the comfortable luxury that spoke of frequent use rather than mere investment, invited relaxation in a way that Riverside's grandeur somehow discouraged. "This is lovely," Charlotte breathed, moving through rooms that felt designed for 2 people rather than the dozens who populated plantation life. The master bedroom, with its view of the park and its 4-poster bed draped in cream silk, seemed to await the intimacies that their careful courtship had postponed through months of proper behavior and gradual acquaintance. Alexander watched her explore their temporary sanctuary with an expression that combined desire with patience, understanding with anticipation. "I thought," he said quietly, "that we might benefit from time away from the obligations that claim so much of our attention at Riverside. Sometimes closeness requires privacy that plantation life cannot provide." The days in Savannah passed like a beautiful dream, punctuated by moments of deeper awakening. They walked through the historic squares where azaleas bloomed in riots of pink and white, attended evening concerts where European musicians performed for audiences that included the most sophisticated society from Charleston to New Orleans, and dined at restaurants where French chefs created culinary magic from low-country ingredients. Yet it was in the quiet privacy of their townhouse that the most significant discoveries occurred. Away from the watchful eyes of servants, the expectations of society, and the constant demands of plantation management, Charlotte and Alexander began to explore the emotional and physical possibilities of their marriage with a courage that surprised them both. One evening, as spring thunderstorms rolled in from the Atlantic and rain drummed against the windows with tropical intensity, Charlotte found herself standing before her bedroom mirror in the silk nightgown that had been part of her trousseau, garments chosen for a bride who had expected duty rather than desire from marriage. The reflection that gazed back at her showed a woman transformed by months of security, intellectual stimulation, and growing affection into someone she barely recognized, someone capable of love and worthy of being loved in return. A soft knock at the door made her heart race, and Alexander's voice, gentle but unmistakably hopeful, requested permission to enter. Charlotte opened the door to find her husband bearing a tea service and wearing an expression that combined tenderness with barely controlled desire. "I thought," he said, setting the silver tray on a small table near the window where lightning illuminated the storm-tossed park, "that we might talk. There are things I should like to say if you are willing to listen." They settled into chairs that faced each other across a small distance that felt charged with possibility, and Alexander began to speak words that Charlotte had not dared to hope she would ever hear from the man who had married her, for practical reasons rather than romantic ones. "Charlotte, these months have taught me that the heart does not consult convenience when choosing where to bestow its affections. I entered our marriage seeking partnership and found myself discovering love, not the passionate infatuation of youth, but something deeper and more enduring. You have become precious to me in ways I did not expect and cannot adequately express." Charlotte felt tears threaten as she absorbed the sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, and the weight of emotions that transformed their careful arrangement into something sacred and irreversible. "Alexander," she whispered, "I have been afraid to admit how much my feelings have changed, how much you have come to mean to me. This marriage has become the greatest blessing of my life, but I feared it presumptuous to hope that you might feel similarly." He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with a reverence that made her breath catch. "My dear Charlotte, there is nothing presumptuous about acknowledging love when it exists. I love you, not as a convenient wife or an accomplished hostess, but as the woman who has brought light into rooms I had thought forever shadowed by loss." The storm outside seemed to pause as Charlotte leaned forward to touch her husband's face with trembling fingers, marveling at the texture of his skin, the warmth of his breath, the reality of affection that had grown from careful respect into something that demanded expression beyond words. "Are you certain you want this marriage to become everything it could be, rather than the safe arrangement we both expected?" "I am certain," Charlotte whispered, and as thunder rolled across savannah and rain sang against their windows, she discovered that love, when it comes to those who have learned to treasure it, can transform even the most practical arrangements into poetry written in the language of two hearts, finally brave enough to speak the same beautiful truth. May returned them to Charleston like a symphony reaching its crescendo, and Charlotte found herself stepping into the role of plantation mistress with a confidence born of love, secure and purpose discovered. "Are you certain?" Alexander asked, his voice rough with emotion as he read the answer in her eyes. The townhouse on East Bay Street, which had seemed merely elegant during her engagement, now felt like a sanctuary where she and Alexander could continue the intimate conversations that had deepened their marriage beyond mere arrangement into genuine partnership. The Charleston social season of 1851 glittered with unusual brilliance, as if the city itself sensed the prosperity that cotton wealth and rice cultivation had brought to low-country society. The St. Cecilia Society Ball, held in the magnificent mansion of the Rutledge family, provided Charlotte's debut as Mrs. Alexander Pemberton, no longer the impoverished relation dependent upon charity, but the mistress of one of South Carolina's greatest plantations. Charlotte moved through the receiving line wearing silk the color of champagne, her mother's pearls lustrous against skin that glowed with the contentment of a woman beloved. Alexander, resplendent in evening attire that emphasized his distinguished bearing, remained at her side with a possessiveness that spoke of pride rather than mere propriety. The assembled guests, rice and cotton aristocracy, Charleston merchants, even visiting European nobility, received them with the deference due to wealth. But Charlotte detected something more, genuine respect for the grace with which she had transformed herself from object of pity into figure of admiration. "Mrs. Pemberton," murmured Mrs. Jonathan Rhett, the acknowledged queen of Charleston society, "marriage appears to agree with you remarkably well. You positively glow with happiness." Charlotte accepted the compliment with composure that would have impressed her mother, understanding that such approval from Mrs. Rhett carried more weight than formal recognition from government officials. "Thank you, Mrs. Rhett. I am indeed blessed in my marriage and my circumstances." But it was during the gentlemen's discussion following dinner that Alexander surprised Charleston society in ways that would be whispered about for years to come. The conversation had turned, as it inevitably did among plantation owners, to the management of enslaved labor and the economic pressures facing agricultural operations in an era of uncertain markets and political tensions. "The future prosperity of South Carolina," Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority of success and intelligence, "may well depend upon our willingness to adapt traditional methods to changing circumstances. I have found that investing in the welfare of workers, providing better housing, medical care, and even basic education, produces results that exceed the costs involved." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the clink of crystal as gentlemen set down glasses and absorbed the implications of what they had heard. Charleston society prided itself on progressive thinking, but Alexander's words suggested reforms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the management of enslaved populations. Judge Harrison Pinckney, whose rice plantation competed with Riverside for dominance in low-country agriculture, leaned forward with interest that overrode social caution. "Are you suggesting, Pemberton, that education for slaves produces economic benefits? That would seem to contradict conventional wisdom about the dangers of literacy among the workforce." Alexander met the challenge with the confidence of a man whose success provided irrefutable evidence for his methods. "I am suggesting that intelligent workers, regardless of their legal status, are more valuable than ignorant ones. The ability to read simple instructions, to understand basic arithmetic, to communicate clearly, these skills increase productivity while reducing the need for constant supervision." The controversy that followed would occupy Charleston drawing rooms for weeks, dividing opinion between those who considered Alexander dangerously progressive and those who found his arguments economically compelling. Charlotte listened to the heated discussions with growing understanding that her husband's views placed them at the center of debates that transcended plantation management to touch the fundamental questions facing Southern society. Yet it was in the privacy of their townhouse library, away from the scrutiny of society and the pressure of public opinion, that Charlotte and Alexander explored the implications of their evolving convictions. Their conversations, which had begun with practical matters of household management, now encompassed moral and philosophical questions that challenged everything they had been taught about their world. "I find myself troubled," Charlotte confessed one evening as they sat before the fire, rain pattering against windows that overlooked Charleston Harbor, "by the contradictions between our Christian beliefs and our daily practices. How can we speak of human dignity while owning human beings? How can we claim to follow Christ's teachings while profiting from a system that denies basic humanity to so many?" Alexander set aside the book he had been reading, a treatise on political economy that explored alternatives to slave labor, and moved to sit beside Charlotte on the sofa they had come to prefer for their most intimate conversations. "These questions torment me daily," he admitted, taking her hand in his with the gesture that had become their private signal of trust and understanding. "I inherited this system, Charlotte, and I am embedded within it so deeply that extraction seems impossible without destroying everything our families have built. Yet how can we justify perpetuating injustice merely to preserve privilege?" The discussions that followed, conducted in whispers because even their own servants might report dangerous opinions to other plantation families, revealed the complexity of their moral position. They were reformers trapped within a system that resisted fundamental change, idealists constrained by economic realities, Christians struggling to reconcile faith with practice in a society that had constructed elaborate theological justifications for human bondage. As spring dissolved into summer and the social season reached its pinnacle, Charlotte realized that love had done more than transform her marriage. It had awakened her conscience to questions that would shape not only their private lives, but the future of the South itself. Summer 1851 settled over Riverside like a benediction, heavy with possibility and fraught with tension, as national political currents swirled around the quiet low-country plantation where Charlotte and Alexander had begun to implement changes that whispered revolution in voices too soft for casual observers to detect. The Compromise of 1850 had supposedly settled the great questions dividing North and South, but thoughtful people understood that such forced solutions merely postponed rather than resolved fundamental conflicts about the nature of American society. Charlotte stood in the plantation office, reviewing accounts that told stories more complex than mere profit and loss. The improvements Alexander had authorized, better housing for workers, expanded medical care, even the small school where basic literacy was taught to children in the quarters, showed costs that would have shocked traditional plantation managers. Yet productivity had increased and, more importantly, the atmosphere at Riverside had transformed from sullen compliance to something approaching cooperation. "Mrs. Pemberton," said Timothy Fletcher, the young overseer whom Alexander had hired despite his lack of experience with enslaved labor. "The accounts for the medical program show remarkable results. Fewer lost workdays due to illness, better outcomes for mothers and infants, even improved longevity among the older workers. Whatever additional costs we incur are more than offset by increased productivity." Charlotte nodded, understanding that Timothy's carefully neutral language concealed opinions that would have branded him a dangerous radical in most low-country circles. A graduate of Harvard College who had come south seeking opportunity, Timothy brought northern perspectives to plantation management that challenged every assumption about the necessity of harsh discipline and deliberate ignorance among enslaved populations. The changes at Riverside had not escaped notice among neighboring planters, and the reactions ranged from curious interest to barely concealed hostility. Judge Pinckney's visits had become more frequent and more pointed, his questions probing the philosophical foundations of reforms that produced undeniable economic benefits while threatening the social order that sustained plantation aristocracy. "Pemberton's innovations bear watching," Charlotte overheard Mrs. Pinckney confiding to Mrs. Rhett during a ladies' tea party held at the Rutledge Mansion. "Success that comes from treating slaves like human beings raises uncomfortable questions about traditional methods. If his approach proves broadly applicable, it could undermine justifications that have sustained our entire way of life." Yet even as external pressures mounted, Charlotte found herself drawn deeper into the moral complexities of their situation. The literacy program that she had helped establish in the quarters produced results that both thrilled and terrified her. Children who had been taught to read simple Bible verses progressed rapidly to more complex texts, demonstrating intellectual capacities that contradicted every justification for treating human beings as property. One evening in August, as heat lightning flickered over the Ashley River and the air hung heavy with the promise of rain, Charlotte encountered something that would haunt her dreams for months to come. Walking through the quarters to check on a worker's sick child, she glimpsed through an open door a young man teaching himself to write, using charcoal on a piece of wood and copying letters from a scrap of newspaper he had somehow acquired. The intensity of his concentration, the hunger for knowledge that radiated from his bent figure, the raw intelligence evident in his careful reproduction of words he might not even understand, all combined to create an image that shattered Charlotte's remaining illusions about the moral neutrality of even reformed slavery. This was a human soul yearning for education, for dignity, for the basic rights that she and Alexander took for granted, yet trapped within a legal system that denied his fundamental humanity. "Ma'am," the young man said, scrambling to his feet when he noticed her presence, fear evident in his eyes as he attempted to hide the evidence of his forbidden learning. "Please," Charlotte said softly, her voice trembling with emotions she could barely contain, "don't let me interrupt your studies. What you are doing, it takes great courage." The conversation that followed, conducted in whispers beneath the moss-draped oaks that had witnessed generations of injustice, revealed depths of longing and intelligence that Charlotte knew she could never adequately describe to Alexander or anyone else who had not witnessed such moments personally. The young man, Robert, she learned, though surnames were forbidden to enslaved people, spoke with eloquence that would have impressed Charleston's most educated circles, demonstrated reasoning that surpassed many white men of her acquaintance, and displayed knowledge of current events that he had gleaned from discarded newspapers and overheard conversations. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said finally, his voice carrying dignity that no legal system could diminish, "I know that learning to read and write is forbidden, that what I'm doing could bring punishment for me and trouble for you and Mr. Alexander if it were discovered, but I can't help myself. The need to understand, to learn, to be more than what this system allows, it burns in me like fire that won't be extinguished." Charlotte returned to the mansion that night with tears streaming down her face and a heart so heavy with moral complexity that she feared it might break under the weight of understanding. She found Alexander in the library, reading by lamplight, and without preamble told him everything she had witnessed and felt. "My dear Charlotte," Alexander said, setting aside his book and drawing her into his arms with the tenderness that had become their refuge from a world that demanded impossible choices, "you have seen what I have been struggling to ignore, the fundamental humanity of people we have been taught to regard as property. The question that torments me is not whether our current system is just, but whether we have the courage to act upon our convictions when such action could destroy everything our families have built. As summer thunderstorms rolled across the Low Country and change whispered through the Spanish moss like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud, Charlotte and Alexander faced questions that would test not only their marriage, but their souls, knowing that love had awakened them to truths that could no longer be denied or ignored. Spring 1852 arrived at Riverside like a symphony written in dogwood blossoms and azalea blooms, but Charlotte barely noticed the spectacular display of low country beauty that had captivated her during previous seasons. Her attention had turned inward, focused on the miraculous reality growing within her body, the child who would be born into a world of privilege and complexity, inheriting both the blessings and burdens of plantation aristocracy in an era when such inheritance carried moral weight that previous generations had never acknowledged. The pregnancy had been confirmed by Dr. Morrison, Charleston's most distinguished physician, during a spring visit that combined medical consultation with social call. Alexander's joy, evident in his transformed bearing and the tender solicitude with which he attended Charlotte's every need, reminded her daily that love had indeed conquered the practical arrangements that had brought them together. "A May baby," Dr. Morrison announced, his satisfaction evident as he packed away the instruments of his examination. "Mrs. Pemberton appears to be in excellent health, and there is every reason to expect a successful confinement. I recommend the usual precautions: adequate rest, gentle exercise, avoidance of excessive excitement, though I must say plantation life seems to agree with you remarkably well." Charlotte spent the languid days of late pregnancy reading in the garden pavilion that Alexander had constructed for her comfort, surrounded by jasmine and honeysuckle that perfumed the air with sweetness. The books that occupied her attention reflected the evolution of her thinking: treatises on education, accounts of women's roles in social reform, even carefully concealed pamphlets about alternative approaches to labor management that challenged every assumption of Southern society. The child moved within her with increasing vigor as summer approached, and Charlotte found herself speaking to this unborn soul about the world he or she would inherit. "You will be born to privilege, my little one," she would whisper, her hand stroking the rounded curve of her belly. "But with privilege comes responsibility. You must learn to use your advantages not merely for personal benefit, but for the betterment of all who share this beautiful, troubled world." Alexander's transformation during these months revealed depths of paternal instinct that surprised them both. He abandoned his usual reserve to speak enthusiastically about nursery preparations, educational plans that began with infancy, and the hopes he harbored for a child who might grow up in a South more just than the one they currently inhabited. "This child," he said one evening, as they sat in the garden watching fireflies begin their nightly dance, "will know a different world than the one we inherited. I am determined that our son or daughter will be educated to think independently, to question inherited assumptions, to choose moral courage over social convenience when such choices become necessary." The labor began on a May morning when the Ashley River ran silver under overcast skies and the air hung heavy with the promise of rain. Charlotte, attended by Dr. Morrison and assisted by Patience and Clarissa, the plantation's most experienced midwife, felt the ancient rhythms of childbirth connect her to generations of women who had brought life into the world, despite uncertainty about what that world might hold. "Easy now, Mrs. Pemberton," Clarissa murmured, her skilled hands providing comfort that transcended the legal categories that defined their relationship. "This baby wants to see the world, and we're going to help make that happen." The pain, intense beyond anything Charlotte had imagined, gave way to moments of transcendent clarity where she understood that she was participating in creation itself, bringing forth a soul that had never existed before, adding her own thread to the tapestry of human experience that stretched from past to future in unbroken connection. Edward Alexander Pemberton entered the world just as afternoon thunderstorms broke over the Low Country, his first cries mingling with the sound of rain against windows and thunder rolling across fields where his inheritance grew in neat rows of cotton and rice. Charlotte held her son for the first time with hands that trembled, not from exhaustion, but from awe at the perfect miracle of his existence. The tiny fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength, the dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, the rosebud mouth that would someday speak words that might change the world. Alexander, admitted to the birthing chamber despite conventional prohibitions against masculine presence at such moments, wept openly as he looked upon his heir. "He is perfect, Charlotte, absolutely perfect. Look at those hands. They will accomplish great things. Look at those eyes. They will see clearly in a world that often prefers blindness to truth." The recovery that followed brought visits from neighboring plantation families, each offering congratulations while carefully studying the child who would inherit Riverside's wealth and influence. But Charlotte found herself most moved by the quiet blessings offered by the enslaved women who worked in the mansion, their own maternal experiences creating bonds that transcended legal categories. "That baby got the look of someone who's going to matter in this world," Patience observed, holding young Edward with the expertise of one who had tended countless infants. "He got his daddy's thoughtful eyes and his mama's determined chin. That's a powerful combination, Mrs. Pemberton." As summer deepened and Edward thrived under the careful attention of both parents, Charlotte began to understand that motherhood had intensified rather than diminished her commitment to the reforms that she and Alexander had begun implementing at Riverside. This child would inherit not only wealth and position, but also the moral obligations that such inheritance entailed. Watching her son sleep in the cradle that Alexander's grandfather had crafted for previous generations of Pemberton heirs, Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settle around her like a mantle, knowing that love had given her not only a husband and child to cherish, but a future generation to prepare for the challenges that would surely come. The autumn morning when Alexander led Charlotte down the familiar paths of her childhood carried the weight of resurrection and redemption, as if time itself had conspired to heal wounds that loss had opened 3 years before. Magnolia Grove Plantation, which had been sold at auction to satisfy her father's debts, now belonged to the Pembertons, purchased not for profit, but for love, restored not for display, but for hope. Charlotte's heart stuttered as the carriage rounded the curve that revealed the plantation house where she had been born, where her grandmother's portraits had gazed down from gilded frames, where summer evenings had been spent reading poetry, while mockingbirds provided accompaniment. The Greek Revival column still stood proud against the Carolina sky, but fresh white paint gleamed where weather had previously left stains, and new shutters in Charleston green replaced those that had warped and faded during the years of abandonment. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice caught between tears and laughter, "you have given me back my childhood home, but you have made it something more, something better than it ever was before." The transformation that awaited her inside the mansion exceeded even her most optimistic dreams. Alexander had not simply restored the house to its former elegance, he had redesigned it according to principles that reflected their shared commitment to reform and progress. The quarters that had once housed enslaved workers had been converted to cottages for free laborers, complete with garden plots and space for families to live with dignity. The children who played in the yard attended the small school that Charlotte had established, learning reading and arithmetic alongside the traditional skills that would prepare them for lives of independence rather than bondage. "This is your project now, Charlotte," Alexander said, his arm around her waist as they stood on the front veranda surveying the changes that love and determination had wrought. "Magnolia Grove will be our experiment in proving that agricultural prosperity does not require human bondage, that free labor properly compensated and fairly treated can produce results that exceed those achieved through coercion." The months that followed brought challenges that tested every assumption about Southern agriculture and labor management. The free workers who replaced enslaved laborers demanded wages that shocked traditional plantation economics, and the learning curve associated with voluntary rather than forced labor required patience that many low-country planters would have considered impossible to sustain. Yet by Christmas 1853, the results spoke for themselves. Cotton production at Magnolia Grove matched that of comparable plantations using enslaved labor, while the rice cultivation that Alexander had introduced provided additional income that made the higher labor costs economically sustainable. More importantly, the workers themselves demonstrated productivity and innovation that contradicted every justification for treating human beings as property. "Mrs. Pemberton," said Samuel Roberts, a free man of color who had accepted the position of farm manager, despite skepticism from neighbors who doubted the wisdom of placing such responsibility in black hands, "this year's cotton crop exceeds our most optimistic projections. The workers take pride in their labor when they know they'll share in the profits, and pride produces quality that fear never can. Charlotte found herself documenting the experiment with careful attention to details that might provide guidance for others seeking alternatives to slave labor. Her correspondence with reformers in Charleston and even sympathetic voices in northern cities created networks of support for gradual change that respected property rights while acknowledging human dignity. The birth of Catherine Helen Pemberton in the spring of 1854 provided additional motivation for the reforms that had begun as moral imperatives and evolved into practical successes. Charlotte held her daughter in the same nursery where she herself had been rocked to sleep, understanding that this child would inherit a world where justice and prosperity might coexist rather than competing for dominance. "She will never know the world we inherited," Charlotte told Alexander, as they watched 2-year-old Edward playing with children from the workers' families, his laughter indistinguishable from theirs, his games reflecting innocence about artificial distinctions that their parents' generation had taken for granted. "Our children will assume that freedom and dignity are natural rights rather than privileges reserved for those born to particular circumstances." The success at Magnolia Grove attracted attention that ranged from curious admiration to outright hostility. Visitors came from across the South to observe the Pemberton experiment, and their reactions revealed the deep divisions that would soon tear the nation apart. Progressive planters saw hope for evolution that might preserve Southern society while adapting to changing moral expectations, while traditional aristocrats perceived threats to everything that had defined their world for generations. Pemberton's innovations may produce short-term profits, Judge Pinckney confided to other Charleston gentlemen during a dinner party that Charlotte and Alexander wisely declined to attend, but they undermine the entire foundation of our social order. If slaves can be replaced by free workers, if education produces better results than ignorance, if kindness proves more effective than cruelty, what becomes of the justifications we have used to preserve our way of life? Yet Charlotte and Alexander found themselves supported by unexpected allies, younger planters who had traveled to Europe and witnessed industrial prosperity based on free labor, merchants whose business interests connected them to northern markets where anti-slavery sentiment affected commercial relationships, even some clergy who had begun to question theological justifications for human bondage. As 1854 drew to a close, and political tensions over slavery intensified across the nation, Charlotte realized that their quiet revolution at Magnolia Grove and Riverside had prepared them for changes that would soon transform not only the South, but America itself. The winter of 1855 arrived with an urgency that seemed to press against the windows of Riverside like an unwelcome visitor demanding entry, and Charlotte felt in her bones the approach of reckonings that could no longer be postponed or ignored. National tensions over slavery had reached levels that made thoughtful people whisper about possibilities too terrible to speak aloud, while locally, the success of the Pemberton experiments in free labor had attracted scrutiny that threatened the careful balance they had maintained between reform and survival. Judge Pinckney's carriage arrived at Riverside on a February morning when frost silvered the Spanish moss and the Ashley River reflected a sky the color of pewter. Charlotte watched from the library windows as her husband's most persistent critic stepped down from his vehicle with the bearing of a man prepared for confrontation, and she felt her heart tighten with apprehension about conversations that might determine their family's future. The meeting that followed, conducted in Alexander's study with doors closed against even household servants who might report dangerous words to other plantation families, revealed the extent to which their reforms had challenged not only local customs, but the entire philosophical framework that sustained Southern society. "Pemberton," Judge Pinckney began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of Charleston's legal establishment, "your innovations at Riverside and Magnolia Grove have produced results that cannot be ignored or dismissed. The productivity of free labor, the success of educational programs, the evident prosperity of workers who receive wages rather than whips, all of this challenges assumptions that have guided Southern civilization for generations." Alexander met his adversary's gaze with the confidence of a man whose conscience had been tested and found sound. "Judge Pinckney, I assume you have not come merely to congratulate me on agricultural success. What precisely are you suggesting?" The older man leaned forward, his expression revealing the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond personal interest. "I am suggesting that your example threatens the stability of our entire region. If other planters attempt to replicate your methods, if free labor proves broadly superior to slave labor, if education becomes available to populations that have been kept deliberately ignorant, the consequences could undermine everything our ancestors built. Charlotte listened from the adjoining room, her presence known to both men, but her participation carefully circumscribed by social conventions that still constrained women's direct involvement in such discussions. Yet she understood that her own role in developing and implementing the reforms made her as responsible as Alexander for whatever consequences might follow. The conversation that unfolded over the following hours revealed the complexity of their situation with stark clarity. The Pembertons had succeeded too well in demonstrating alternatives to traditional plantation management, and their success threatened to expose the moral and economic contradictions that sustained the entire system of Southern slavery. "You have a choice, Pemberton," Judge Pinckney said finally, his tone carrying the weight of ultimatum rather than negotiation. "You can abandon these dangerous experiments, return to conventional methods, and preserve your family's position within Charleston society, or you can continue your current course and face the consequences that await those who challenge the foundations of our way of life." After Pinckney's departure, Charlotte found Alexander standing in the library, staring out at the landscape they had transformed through love and commitment to justice. His shoulders carried the weight of decisions that would affect not only their own family, but the hundreds of people whose lives depended upon the choices made in Riverside's mansion. "What will we do?" Charlotte asked, taking her husband's arm with the gesture that had become their signal of mutual support in moments of crisis. Alexander turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the gravity of their situation and the strength of his convictions. "We will continue, Charlotte. We will continue, because abandoning these reforms would betray everyone who has trusted us with their hopes for a better future. We will continue, because our children deserve to inherit a world where justice and prosperity can coexist. We will continue, because love has taught us that some things matter more than safety or social approval." The decision, once made, brought unexpected peace to Charlotte's heart. She had learned through loss and restoration, through arranged marriage transformed into passionate love, through motherhood and social responsibility, that courage often requires choosing the difficult path rather than the safe one. That evening, as they sat before the library fire while their children slept peacefully upstairs, Charlotte and Alexander made plans that would test their commitment to reform against the approaching storm of national crisis. They would expand the educational programs despite local opposition, continue the transition to free labor despite economic uncertainties, and document their methods for others who might attempt similar reforms despite the risks involved. "We may be remembered as failures," Alexander said, holding Charlotte close as rain began to fall against windows that had witnessed so many crucial conversations. "History may judge our efforts as naive idealism that ignored practical realities." Charlotte pressed closer to the man who had given her love, purpose, and the courage to fight for justice, even when such fights seemed hopeless. "Or we may be remembered as pioneers who proved that love can overcome hatred, that justice can triumph over convenience, that human dignity matters more than economic advantage. Either way, we will know that we chose correctly when choice was required." As winter storms swept across the Low Country and political tensions threatened to tear the nation apart, Charlotte and Alexander faced the future with the quiet confidence of people who had learned that true love always demands courage, and that courage, once discovered, becomes a light that no darkness can extinguish. Spring returned to the Low Country in 1855 with the exuberant beauty that had greeted Charlotte's arrival at Riverside 9 years before, but the woman who walked through gardens ablaze with azaleas and dogwood bore little resemblance to the impoverished relation who had once accepted charity from the Ashford family. Charlotte Sophia Campbell Pemberton had become something that even she had not dared to envision, a reformer whose quiet revolution had changed hundreds of lives, a mother whose children would inherit both wealth and conscience, a wife whose love had grown from convenient arrangement into the bedrock upon which an entire family's future rested. The small school that had begun as an experiment in basic literacy had evolved into an institution that attracted visitors from across the South and even from northern states, where educators sought to understand methods that produced remarkable results among populations previously deemed incapable of learning. Charlotte stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse that Alexander had built near the renovated quarters, watching children of former slaves recite poetry with the same facility that Charleston aristocrats' offspring displayed at Miss Pettigrew's Academy for Young Ladies. "Mrs. Pemberton," said Miss Elizabeth Warren, the young teacher from Massachusetts who had accepted Charlotte's invitation to manage the expanded educational program despite warnings about the dangers of teaching in the South. "These children demonstrate intellectual capacities that contradict every justification I have heard for treating human beings as property. Their progress in mathematics, literature, and natural philosophy equals that of any students I taught in Boston." The success of the educational initiatives had attracted support from unexpected quarters: Charleston merchants who recognized that literate workers produced better results, progressive planters who sought alternatives to increasingly expensive slave labor, even some clergy who had begun to question theological justifications for human bondage. Yet it had also intensified opposition from those who perceived threats to the entire structure of Southern society. The afternoon brought news that would test every principle Charlotte and Alexander had developed through years of careful reform. Timothy Fletcher, the young overseer whose Harvard education had prepared him for innovations that challenged traditional plantation management, arrived at the mansion bearing correspondence that would reshape their understanding of the choices they faced. "Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton," Timothy said, his usually composed demeanor betraying excitement that bordered on euphoria, "I have received communications from associates in Boston and New York who have been following our agricultural experiments with great interest. They are prepared to offer financial backing for expansion of free labor farming throughout the South, beginning with plantations whose owners demonstrate commitment to gradual emancipation." The proposal that Timothy outlined exceeded Charlotte's most optimistic dreams, while simultaneously presenting challenges that threatened everything they had built. Northern investors, motivated by moral conviction as much as economic opportunity, offered to purchase enslaved workers at market rates and provide funding for the transition to free labor, but only for planters willing to commit publicly to the eventual elimination of slavery from their operations. "The implications extend far beyond economics," Alexander observed, studying documents that outlined terms that were both generous and revolutionary. "Such a commitment would place us at the center of national debates about slavery's future, possibly making us targets for violence from those who perceive abolition as threats to their entire way of life." Charlotte moved to the window overlooking the gardens, where she had spent countless hours reading, thinking, and gradually developing the convictions that now demanded public expression. The Spanish moss swayed in the afternoon breeze like veils that might conceal or reveal the future, and she felt the weight of decisions that would affect not only their immediate family, but generations yet unborn. "Alexander," she said finally, her voice carrying the strength that loss and love had taught her to claim, "we have spent years preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every reform we have implemented, every life we have touched, every child we have educated, all of it has been leading toward the choice we face today." The conversations that followed, conducted over several days while spring storms swept across the Low Country, revealed the depth of their commitment to principles that had evolved from practical experiments into moral imperatives. They would accept the Northern backing, commit publicly to gradual emancipation, and accept whatever consequences such commitment might bring. The announcement, made through carefully worded advertisements in Charleston newspapers and letters to prominent families throughout the South, sent shockwaves through Low Country society that reverberated far beyond South Carolina's borders. The Pembertons had become the first major plantation family to commit publicly to ending slavery through compensation rather than coercion, and their example would inspire others while making them targets for those who perceived such changes as threats to everything they held sacred. On a May evening when jasmine perfumed the air and mockingbirds sang in the live oaks that had witnessed so many momentous conversations, Charlotte and Alexander sat in the garden where their love had deepened from convenience into commitment. 3-year-old Edward played at their feet while infant Catherine slept in her mother's arms, and Charlotte felt the profound satisfaction that comes to those who have discovered purpose worthy of whatever sacrifices it might require. "Do you regret any of it?" Alexander asked, his voice holding wonder at the journey that had brought them from arranged marriage to revolutionary partnership. "The risks we have taken, the opposition we have faced, the uncertain future we have chosen for our children." Charlotte looked at the man who had given her love, security, and the courage to fight for justice, then at the children who would inherit a world where conscience had triumphed over convenience. "We have learned that love, when it grows in soil nurtured by mutual respect and shared purpose, becomes a force capable of changing the world. As the stars emerged over Riverside Plantation and the Ashley River whispered its ancient songs to the night, Charlotte understood that she had become the woman her childhood dreams had envisioned, not a passive recipient of male protection, but an active agent of change whose influence would extend far beyond the boundaries of any single plantation or family. I regret nothing, my beloved husband. The Charleston rose had indeed bloomed fully, her petals spreading light and fragrance into a world that desperately needed both, proving that love, when it comes to those brave enough to nurture it, can indeed transform the most practical arrangements into poetry, written in the language of justice, courage, and hope eternal.